Good evening to every one of you who have joined us here today at our event. Welcome to our event, Building Trust in Your COVID-19 Response, Ethical and Privacy Principles, held in partnership with Salesforce. And we have a very special guest today, Ms. Paula Goldman, who is the Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer from Salesforce. My name is Ziki, and I lead the community and brand team here at SGInnovate. And for those of you who do not know SGInnovate, we believe that deep tech has the potential to address some of the world's most pressing challenges. Our mission is to work with entrepreneurial scientists to help them build and scale their deep tech startups. We do this by investing in startups, developing talent, and matching them with exciting deep tech startups. And I want to do a shout out here. We are having a virtual talent showcase this Saturday, where over 200 traineeships and job opportunities are available in some of the most exciting startups in our portfolio and in Singapore. So join us. Details will be posted on the chat box. Thank you for joining us today. It's always great to see where people are joining us from. We have a very cozy group today. Do use the chat function and tell us where it is, where you are calling us from. And take the time to connect with the other attendees here. We're finding that, during the time when there's a lot of Zoom activities going on, we still find that there's a lot of interaction at our events and connecting with different people. So do use the chat function for that as well. Now, a few months ago, we at SGInnovate launched the Deep Tech for Good initiative along partners such as Salesforce and other strategic and ecosystem partners like the UNDP Global Center for Technology, Innovation and Sustainable Development, the X Prize Foundation, and Element AI, to name a few. One of the goals of this initiative is to convene an international community of leaders and actors committed to harnessing science and technology for social and economic good. One of the ways to grow this community is by having conversations such as this, to have leaders such as Paula to be joining us and sharing with us what it is that she does in her role and how she actually uses technology or promotes using technology for the greater good. So we're extremely proud to be hosting this session and thankful to be partnering this session with the Salesforce team, whom we've worked with quite a bit in the past 2 years. Given the unprecedented impact that the ongoing pandemic has had on global economies and healthcare systems, today's discussion is even more important in talking about the importance of trust in AI and, more important than ever, how as global markets start to reopen their borders. So beyond COVID-19, humanity is also facing increasing pressures to address big challenges. And time really isn't on our side. So at SGInnovate, we are very passionate about this, and we're contributing our efforts through the building of deep tech companies, a sustainable pool of talent, and a thriving ecosystem. So we're looking forward to the session today, and we're always happy to welcome more people into the Deep Tech for Good initiative, like-minded people who are also wanting to harness deep tech for the greater good. I also want to thank participants who have sent across some of your burning questions for Paula earlier. The format of today's session is we are going to have Paula give about a 20 to 30 minute presentation. And after that, I'll be having a fireside chat with Paula. I'm extremely excited. Paula is the first ever Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer at Salesforce with a very strong record in technology for social good and a focus on helping companies build ethical technology. I'm really looking forward to what Paula has to share and to our chat after that. And without further ado, please let me introduce and invite Paula on stage now to take a few minutes to share about her work. Paula, please. And I think before that, we have a video to play, so perhaps we want to dive straight into that first, Paula.
Sounds good. going to be a big inflection point for the tech industry.
What do you think is happening in tech?
Backlash against the world's largest tech companies.
A crisis of trust in the tech industry.
We all know that if you're human, you're biased.
There are so many issues that need to be addressed that can provide a greater world. Not the doom and gloom that we hear about the dark cloud of the fourth industrial revolution, but a force for positive. Technology is a good thing if used in an ethical manner.
We're all going into uncharted waters here, and we have to have deliberate discussions about this up front.
Technology is not good or bad. It's what you do with it that matters.
That's why we have started an Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Technology.
And we infuse ethics into our entire process.
How do we ensure that the AI is really giving back and helping society?
We have to take our consciousness up a level. We all have to rise up and realize we're in a new world with this technology. This technology is something like we've never had before in each of these categories, and that means our leadership has to get to another level of excellence.
The issues are complex, the answers are not clear, but it's all about listening.
Thank you for that. And it's such a pleasure to be with all of you this morning, your time, this evening, my time. I've heard so many great things about the SGInnovate community, and the Deep Tech Initiative sounds amazing. So I'm so honored to be with you guys today. And obviously, I wish I could be there in person. Funny thing, I was born in Singapore, and I'll date myself here. I was born at a hospital that was then called St. Mark's Hospital, and at the time, I'm told, it was a converted mansion that had like an A&W fast food shop right outside. And now I think it's been renamed several times, and it's a formal hospital called Parkway East. All of which is to say Singapore has, and kind of the broad Singaporean community has a very special place in my heart. While I can't be with you in person, I'm pleased to be with you virtually and to share some of our journey of what we've been doing at Salesforce with the ethical and humane use of technology, especially during this time of crisis. So next slide, please. Here, one thing just to start with is when we think about technology ethics and we think about kind of these broad dialogues about trust in technology and kind of critiques around technology responsibility, we've been here before, and I take comfort in that there have been many industries over history that have adopted responsibility protocols into the way that they've operated. So just to take you back, 120 years or so, think about when commercial automobiles were first being introduced for a commercial market, for a mass market. And it was absolute chaos because automobiles were on the streets with horses and people walking across the street. There were lots of fatalities. It was hard to get anywhere. And then you fast forward to a time a few years later when you had civic leaders, you had industry, you had governments come together to set joint responsibility protocols. So the first traffic light was invented in 1913. We take that for granted, but at the time was a major innovation or step forward. Or the first stop sign just a couple of years later. Again, it's a square piece of metal with the word stop, but it made a very big difference in traffic safety protocols. And then fast forwarding a couple decades later to the seatbelt and so on. The point being, the automobile industry is one of many industries that has adopted these common protocols. And I think this is what we're starting to see with tech and AI and tech and many other forms of tech, other technologies that we're developing. And it shows that it's really important for companies in particular and for all stakeholders to think about what are the rules of the road for how technology can operate responsibly. So you go to the next slide, please. So the Office of Ethical and Humane Use at Salesforce is relatively new. It was started in late 2018. I joined in 2019. And our remit is basically has three parts of the remit. So one is policy, that is to say, setting policy for how customers use our products responsibly. The second we call ethics by design, similar to, say, privacy by design or security by design. This is the idea that we work with our product and engineering teams to make sure that the stuff we're building has responsibility and ethics built in. And then finally, building the field. That is talking to communities like you, talking to governments and the World Economic Forum and lots of other stakeholders to make sure that we're all sharing lessons learned and sort of collaboratively raising all boats together. And actually, we've been super lucky to have had a number of tech ethics meetings with representatives from the Singaporean government as part of our engagement with the World Economic Forum. And there's so many ways that that this community has been really leading the way. If you hear me pausing a bit during my presentation, it's nighttime here. I have two little girls who have a lot of energy, and so from time to time you might hear them in the background. Okay, so let's go to the next slide and talk about our guiding principles. So this is when we set up the Office of Ethical and Humane Use, we didn't have a blueprint for what this might look like. There we go. I don't know if you can hear that, but I can hear that really loud. Shows you what real life is all about. And what I'll say here is when we set up the office, we really looked at our company's values, right? So you see them in the bottom right of the screen. Our values: trust, customer success, innovation, equality. We thought a lot, particularly about trust and particularly about equality, but we realized that we had some really difficult decisions to make, and that these values, while paramount, weren't quite specific enough to help us make decisions on really tough issues. And so we actually turned to our employees and we said, what should be our guiding principles for this journey on ethical use? And you see them on this slide in the rank order in which they voted. So human rights is our top guiding principle, followed shortly by privacy, and so on. And we really use this to prioritize what issues we take on or don't take on. Next slide, please. So over the last couple of years since the office got started, we built a framework for both building responsibility into our products, but also, setting policy around our products. And I don't know about you, but I did not predict a global pandemic leading into this year. But when it hit, we found we had the framework to be able to act quickly with our teams to make sure that whatever we produced would be well taken and responsible within the terms of the crisis. And this is really a test of our office and our readiness. Next slide, please. So tech can play a really important role in a time of crisis. And I'm sure you've all seen this. Tech can help people understand, can help get test results to people quicker. It can literally help save lives. But we also, and we see, for example, how quickly Singapore was able to use technology to have a very quick and effective response to the first wave of the epidemic. Now, we also see in the headlines, basically news that kind of captures people's distrust of technology. And when we thought about this in a Salesforce, in a sort of a Salesforce context, we thought in particular, when we're developing technology within the COVID context, we want to think about, for example, marginalized populations that might not have equal access to the technology. We've seen in the US context, for example, how increasingly communities of color have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And we see all over the world that there's a small but important percentage of the population, for example, that doesn't have an internet. It doesn't have internet at home, or doesn't have a personal computer, or may not have a smartphone. And we think about what we develop and how it can be broadly accessible to all people, to make sure that we have the maximum uptake and effectiveness of the technology in a time of crisis. Next slide, please. So the Singaporean case is really, really interesting to me. You see here, and this is from the Edelman survey, really high trust in business. Really high trust in government. And you see this, we see it time and time again, trusting the government to make the right decisions with the benefit of people in mind. But we see a slight decrease in trust in business. And that decrease in trust in business is pretty consistent with global markets. There is definitely a deepening crisis of trust in business all over the world. And it makes it all the more important that when we're developing these technology solutions that we're thinking trust is our number one value. Trust is paramount. And we really need to think about how we inspire trust in the technology. Because at the end of the day, your solution is only as good as how, it's only going to be adopted if people trust it. Next slide, please. So how do we build trust in a COVID-19 solution? We started getting lots of questions from our customers, from our partners, from civil society members, as they were looking at all these new technologies, whether it was digital contact tracing or it was lots of different technologies that were being developing in the context of COVID-19. And we decided first and foremost to jump out just putting out a set of principles, and we can distribute the broader document here because we've published them in more detail, but essentially looking at like, what are the things to keep in mind as you're developing COVID-19 solutions? And the first, consistent at least with our own values and principles, is protecting human rights and equality. That is to say, making sure that we're not adversely affecting already vulnerable populations. So thinking about not only income disparities, but people with disabilities, as we said before, people that might not have access to a computer. And I'm told, for example, that in Singapore, only 80% of households have a personal computer. The stats are pretty similar in the United States. These are issues to think of, when you think about that last mile challenge and adoption, it's really, really important. A second one, honoring transparency. So here, thinking about, okay, if you're collecting sensitive data, and listen, there's little data that's more sensitive than personal health information, explaining why that data is being collected and what's going to be done with that data, or minimizing data collection, right? So really making sure when you're designing a product that's collecting data that you've asked yourself, do I absolutely need this information? What is the minimum possible data to achieve the best result? And so on. So we released this to our community. Next slide, please. But we also went deep with our product teams on this. And this is an example of how we went super, super deep with our team that was developing a product called Work.com. So Work.com in a nutshell is a product that enables employers, whether they be educational institutions or for-profit companies or governments, to reopen safely. And we worked to make these principles come to life as we were building this product in record speed with a lot of uncertainty because of what was going on all over the world. And so here's some examples of what we did. So for example, protect human rights and equality. Well, here we went super deep on multi-language capability so that folks, for example, in a US context, there's a lot of folks that don't speak English. Spanish is a really important language, for example. We wanted to make sure that it was accessible for people that speak Spanish. Accessibility standards, and also thinking about, folks that don't have smartphones, how would they access this as well? Honoring transparency, a second principle. So we have this feature in the product called a wellness check. So this is basically like you're going to work, you've got, a little quiz that you take that just basically says, do you have any symptoms of COVID-19? But it also explains under the transparency principle, why are we collecting this data and what's going to happen with it on behalf of the employer that's collecting it. And similarly, the same feature as we're thinking about minimizing data collection, we went really, really deep with that product team. And we said, okay, so you need to ask, for example, do you have a cough? Are you having trouble breathing? There's a number of symptoms of COVID-19, obviously, but actually you don't need to record the individual symptoms. Like you could ask about all the symptoms, but you could record it as a single yes/no attestation so that the administrator doesn't necessarily need to know, what specific symptoms Paula might have, right? To protect my privacy or whoever might be filling out the survey. And then finally, ensure the security of personal data. So this was pretty unique in our history, but when customers purchased Work.com from us, we encouraged them to set up a whole separate command center instance. Basically what that means is the data is partitioned. And by default then, only a few people could get access to it who really needed it, because we recognize that the data is so sensitive. Now, you may be thinking, and rightly so, all of these types of examples I gave you are small design choices, and that's true. And I think this is kind of the magic of responsible technology, right? It comes down to sometimes a very small collection of small design choices that can make a massive impact in the technology when it's introduced at scale. So next slide, please. So I hope I gave you a sense of how we've approached at Salesforce the topic of ethical use of technology in a time of crisis. Certainly we've learned a lot from this time of crisis. And it's been humbling in many ways, but I do think we're proud of how we've been able to put our values into action with our products at this time. I'm really looking forward to this fireside chat with Ziki. But I will say there's a few resources you can look at in terms of both ethical use in COVID and ethical use overall. So we have a Twitter handle, as you can see. There's Trailhead, which is our free online learning platform, and we have a course about the responsible creation of AI, and we have a number of other ethical use courses coming. And finally, our latest content on our newsroom covering ethical use during COVID and many other topics. So all of which is just to say, like, we are only as good as our community. And I really am looking forward to this conversation with all of you and would love to stay connected. And with that, I will pause and turn it over to Ziki.
Thank you, Paula. That was wonderful. You know, we've had a couple of executives from Salesforce join some of our community events. And I must say, I'm very impressed with how Salesforce puts ethics, and a lot of times it's top driven, isn't it? So I'm also very keen for you to share with the participants here about your background, because as I was reading it, you walk the talk, right? Share with us your background, and to give us some context, you know, tell us how that shaped your views and led to where you are today at Salesforce.
Yeah, sure. Well, as you heard when I started, right, I was born in Singapore. I lived in Indonesia as a kid. As a young adult, I lived in rural India, I lived in Ghana, I lived in Kenya, I lived in Bosnia, and so on. I just grew very fascinated by, one, the role of business in shaping social good, and then two, specifically the role of technology in that process. Just to think about how societies have been so transformed by technology. And I think that really animated my career for quite a long time. What I'll say is, you know, a couple of years ago, it became super clear that that technology, I was a techno-optimist. I'm still a techno-optimist. I believe technology can do incredible things. It's also very clear that technology can have unintended consequences, and that we really need to think about that. And I believe very firmly that there will be a day when people think, wait, there was a time when people didn't think about the unintended consequences of technology? Just like, you mean there was a time cars didn't have seatbelts? Yeah. Or there was a time when, you know, technology companies shipped products without thinking about security concerns? Because, you know, all of these things have evolved. And I think we're just at the beginning of that journey with technology, but that's really what has driven my personal motivation around it.
Do you think there'll be a time in future where people will say, you mean people don't wear masks when they go out?
It could be. I mean, we've certainly, or you mean people don't work from home, or like, yeah, it may well be, right? I think that a lot of these changes we're all going through maybe much longer lived than any of us realize. Yeah, it's possible.
So you being the first ever Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer at Salesforce, explain to us what is your definition and what is Salesforce's definition of ethical and the humane use of technology?
Yeah, so it's really comes down to, it's funny, you know, when you talk about technology ethics, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what does ethics mean? Because the first question folks will ask, and again, rightly so, is whose ethics are we talking about? So at the end of the day, it comes down to what's your North Star? What are your values? How do you use those to, prioritize the issues and the guardrails that you're building into your technology? And then also, how do you hold yourself accountable? So in that opening video, I talk about listening, and listening is so important. More than ever, companies especially, have so many stakeholders that we need to attend to. And folks will have very, very different perspectives, but the first step is really building those mechanisms to listen at scale, and more importantly, to make those learnings affect the actual products that you're developing. And if I had to summarize what is ethical use at Salesforce, that's my summary.
So it's interesting. I mean, I've been in corporate before coming onto this role, and we all know that corporates are run by numbers, right? We are all on a 90-day cycle. So how does that impact Salesforce, in needing to meet these quarterly numbers? This focus on the ethical, how do you kind of like bring the ethical and humane use of technology into play? How does this help with the company's bottom line?
Yeah.
And, share some examples in terms of how Salesforce has done that. And you talked too about, different levels of ethics from the different cultural contexts as well. And Salesforce being a global company, how do you actually look at that from across different geographies and different countries, because there are different baselines, right?
So many questions all at once, all good questions. Okay, so let me take your last question first. So how do we think about it from a global context? So really, really good question. And what I would say, I guess a handful of things. One is when we make a policy decision, we have something called an Ethical Use Advisory Council, which has outside experts on tech ethics, it has executives, and it has frontline employees from across the company, and it also has international representation. And we will absolutely run it by, run through a lens. We'll run it through a decision through a values lens. We'll run it through, what's the industry standard here? Do we need to create an industry standard? Like, what are the intended and unintended consequences of this policy? But we will also absolutely run it through an international lens and think about what are the different views in different markets on this policy. And it's a journey, and we're learning, and we're still early in this journey, and we have a lot more work to do on the internationalization of it, but that's how we're thinking about it right now. Your other question, now I've totally lost track of your other question. What was the first part of it?
In terms of the bottom line.
Okay.
Salesforce as a corporate company having to answer to shareholders, right?
Absolutely.
How do you manage that? Because ethics, a lot of companies, and sustainability is kind of like trending right now, right? And ethics and sustainability. And a lot of companies kind of like do that as a tick in the box, right? Mm-hmm. But how, I know that with Salesforce, it's embedded within your DNA from the top. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the ethical and humane use of technology over profits and margin? How do you do that?
Yeah, and I don't want to oversimplify it, because it's the right question to ask, and it's an important question, and those are real dynamics. But what I will say is I really strongly believe that, especially in the long term, there really is no tension between these two goals. That is to say, it all comes down to trust. Trust is more and more important with every passing year. And that if people don't trust your company, they're not going to buy from you, right? And so if you don't take care of these issues, it is going to hit your bottom line at the end of the day. And so that's really how we think about it. It's like that's the top kind of, that's how I'd summarize it. But I would also say, in some ways, ethics can be a differentiator. So it can be a differentiator for employees. I think a lot of folks, seems still a very competitive job market, even in the context of a pandemic. And a lot of folks come to Salesforce because they care about our values, and they care about the kind of company that we are in the world, right? And that matters a great deal. It matters a great deal for retention as well. Mm-hmm. And it matters with our customers too. Like, you think about in our customer community, like there's a lot of folks that are very driven to be part of this values-based community. So we do see it playing out, but it takes seeing the long-term perspective and integrating that into the business model.
And I think that's key, right? I think, me as a marketeer, the whole thing around brand building, right? It's a long-term process.
Yeah.
I think it's the same in your role and, in terms of ethics. And if I kind of think also with the millennials and the next generation, my kids, right? Your kids, they're a lot more aware. And I think these issues are a lot more important. And by the time they grow up and become decision makers in corporates, right?
Yeah,
I think that's going to be a playing factor in terms of, the type of partners that they're working with, the type of companies that they're engaging with. So it's very refreshing because, that's something that's really close to our heart at SGInnovate. And I know it's close to yours too, because when I look at your background and things that you've been doing around impact investing, it's a long road and conversations like this are important. Having a role that that Salesforce has created for you to join and, for you to be a part of the leadership team, I think says a lot for Salesforce as a company. And I wanted to also check with you in terms of, can you give us specific examples, right, of the ethical and humane use of technology? Are there specific examples that you can share and how this has actually helped with the company's bottom line? Are there real examples?
Yes, and here, so let me take that question two ways. So first of all, and again, I think it's great to drill into this. These are the right questions to be asking, and this is the conversation we have to have as a society, right? But trust is built over time, as you just said. Brands are built over time and destroyed in an instant.
Absolutely.
And so when you think about how does this contribute to the bottom line, you first have to start there. And unfortunately, this is the place where I can't go into a lot of detail with you, but I will say you avoid a lot of crises. And we've seen a lot of crises that have had the potential, something that had the potential to become a crisis. That we've said we avoided that because we made the right decision about how we were going to build our product or what we were going to do, right? But more tangibly to say too, I just went through a bunch of examples about what we did with work.com. Absolutely. We had customers asking us about privacy concerns during the COVID pandemic. And we were able to equip our salespeople to talk about that. And that really made a difference in a number of deals. We're very, very deep on ethical AI. We developed a number of tools to help our customers use AI responsibly, even if they are not themselves data scientists, right? Mm-hmm. So to think about, for example, the big risk in AI is bias, right? It's about sort of giving the veneer of objectivity but in fact sort of potentially automating bias against particular groups, right? And so not only have we gone out of our way to make sure that the models that we're building, that we take bias out of them to the greatest extent possible, but also, working to equip our customers with tools where they can, for example, just say I don't want to include race in this model, or, I don't want to include race, and I know zip code's affiliated with race, and so I'm going to hide zip code as well from this model. Again, when we are in a motion with our customers, and particularly the ones that, are bigger accounts, ones we've had for a long time, and that we've got, strong ongoing relationships, these are very, very important to us. And they ask questions about this stuff, right? And if we didn't have answers to these questions, you better believe it would start to put cracks in our relationships, right? And so, I think what you're seeing from my answer, right, is, again, it contributes to the bottom line. It contributes to the bottom line over time.
Mm. Yeah, and I know we said, we wouldn't take questions from the floor, but, we can never stop the actions of our very vibrant community. I think there was only one question which I wonder whether you're okay to take, Paula, but this question around, is trust really that important? You've kind of talked about that, right? But companies that are seeing business improving and the numbers on the positive trend, but they may not be the most loved and trusted. I can think of a few companies, but I guess I shouldn't name them. But, what do you think about that, right? Because at the end of the day, it is still about the bottom line. You know what I mean? So how do we kind of like match that difference? And I guess I'm kind of like, I guess it's also at the end of the day how consumers choose it, right? Is a consumer's decision that's going to be determining whether the companies.
Absolutely. Right. Well, I'd love for someone to defend that trust doesn't matter, but point taken. Yes, on consumers are very, very important. Earlier last year, Salesforce Research did a study with consumers and asked them kind of about these emerging sets of attitudes about ethics and business. I think it was something like, I have to go check back at the number, but 75% said they would be more loyal to a company that displayed good ethics. And look, it's not often defined kind of in these ethereal terms. It's more like, hey, when this company personalizes ads, are they personalizing ads in a way that, is really invasive, or in a way that makes me love them more? When I see them in the news, what's the gut feeling that I have about the headlines that are associated with this company? It more and more matters to consumers. I don't want to downplay the importance of the question, right? But I would say, even when you think about, and I also don't want to get into a discussion about individual companies, but we look at what's happening in tech, and we see companies that have failed to anticipate some of these questions, adding, very, very significant investments that do drag the bottom line to finally address these questions, right? It really, really matters. And we feel fortunate that we are anticipating stuff and working and doing our best to look out at the future and make sure we're addressing the most important issues.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Paula. You talked earlier a little bit about AI trust and how we're collecting data, and I think COVID has shown privacy is a huge concern, and all these are important conversations that we must have, right? Because if people don't trust it, then they're not going to be using it, and then the success is going to be impacted. I want to talk, you shared a little bit about stakeholder engagement. You talked about stakeholders. The value of stakeholder engagement. With ethics, who is your key stakeholder, and how do you make sure all these voices are heard?
Yeah, that's a good question. And frankly, if you had asked me what my biggest challenge is, that's my biggest challenge. Because as I said before, when you talk about ethics, the question is whose ethics? That's the most important question, whose ethics? And so it really matters that we're listening to all of our stakeholders and incorporating that. And so we think about who are most important stakeholders. It's very hard to prioritize. We listen a great deal to our employees. We listen a great deal to our customers, to the communities especially where we have headquarters, but all the communities in which we do business. And the question is, how do we listen at scale? And some of that is building off of existing platforms that we have, right? So for example, within our employee community, we have a lot of platforms where people can share concerns either confidentially or on the record. So we've got a confidential hotline if someone has a concern about technology ethics. We host office hours. We have town halls and whatnot, and an email handle. And all of this, I think, allows us, the last thing we want to do is be surprised by a problem. We know that our employees are our frontline and that they are going to see problems before they become crises. And so we've developed all these channels for listening. Same thing with customers, right? We have a channel where customers sort of upvote, and especially our administrators upvote what their wish list is for Salesforce products. And we mine that data for comments about ethics. And again, it's not generally framed necessarily at the uber level around technology ethics, but theoretically, it's framed around privacy and marketing. It's framed around AI and bias. It gets pretty granular, and that's where we pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. And then the same thing with communities, right? So we're very, very actively engaged in the World Economic Forum. We actually helped them start a tech ethics community, seconded a couple of fellows there. And that includes as I mentioned before, you know, it has representatives of the Singaporean government and other, you know, various governments around the world. It has companies, it has civil society organizations. And sorry to belabor this point, but one more thing to mention, which is when we think about policy decisions, we also think about like, okay, who are the communities that would be affected by this policy decision? And how do we get to the civil society organizations that are experts on the ground and very deeply connected with these communities to get their counsel on these products? It is an ongoing journey. We have a lot of room to grow, but it is extremely important to the success of the role.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that if everyone, you know, and it's baby steps, right? Not everyone's going to come on board straight away, but I think as more and more companies, individuals, spokespeople, thought leaders, you know, make that, champion this cause, right? And I think then we will slowly get there, but it is going to be a long journey. Let's move on and delve in a little bit more about this issue with trust. I think that, you know, Salesforce is certainly trying to lead with trust. And, you know, with COVID, and we touched a little bit about it around, you know, data collection and privacy issues. This has become more and more important as the world starts to reopen the economies. So in your view, what do you think has changed with COVID in terms of definitions, speed of development of technology? What do you think has changed, and what do we need to do? What do countries need to do?
Wow, that's a big question. I know this is being recorded, so I'm going to, you know, 3 years from now, I'm going to look back at my answer and think, was I accurate? Was I not accurate? Because you think about so much has changed in such a short period of time, right? Whether it's the fact that I'm sitting here in my home office talking to you, which I never would have imagined a year ago, to the fact that, you know, there's contact tracing apps, that there are increasingly, you know, I was looking at a recent poll that said, this is a US poll, but it said something like 80% of Americans were more comfortable, or to say more willing, comfortable is the wrong word, more willing to share data about their personal health than they would be if there weren't a pandemic, because they understand the reason why they might need to share that data, but also more nervous than ever about what companies were going to do with it, right? So it's very hard to predict what's going to happen with those kind of divergent trends. And my hope is that that we're setting the guardrails now around that. Like if you think about, for example, the Google Apple contact tracing app, that's very privacy preserving, or when you think about like the different protocols that we're going to and the safety guardrails that are put in, that becomes durable and lasting. Because if not, I think we have to think forward, like to a day when there is no more pandemic, and do we still feel comfortable sharing this kind of personal health data? And that's, I think, what we're trying to make sure that we're making good long-term decisions about what we're building with respect to that.
Well, I think when you talk about some of these actions that are being taken, and you know, you mentioned about Google and everything else, right? It is still back to how much we trust, because at the end of the day, it's about trusting what they say, that there are all these privacy protocols, right? Yeah. So, yeah, thanks for that. So just again, keeping with trust in mind, how do you build ethical and privacy principles into the Salesforce work? Can you talk us through how you built these principles?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, so there was a slide on this, what the ethical use principles, which nest under our corporate values. And I will say, you know, the fact that we asked our employees to stack rank them was really important, because we didn't want it we wanted it to be a participatory exercise. But I will say, you know, I talked about those kind of inbound listening channels that we have, and we're listening to our customers, we're listening to our employees, we're listening to, I'm constantly monitoring the news, because I will tell you there's like no news story that I don't have to really think about, right? And its implications for the world and for our technology, constantly monitoring. And you can imagine that creates quite a prioritization problem, right? I have a team, it's not an army. We got to prioritize. And so the principles come into use there first. When you think about what issues are we going to take on? Where does it matter, right? Like, okay, so on the policy side, for example, if you look at our acceptable use policy, which governs all of our products use case, you'll see some really interesting stuff there. And there's some stuff, for example, and let me cut to the chase and then I'll give you the details. The headline is, it all aligns to human rights, or a lot of it aligns to human rights and privacy as the pull through. We have a number of really interesting things in our acceptable use policy that are pretty unique to Salesforce. For example, it says if you're using a Salesforce bot, you can't use it in such a way that convinces the end user that they're interacting with a human being instead of a bot. It also says, if you're using Salesforce technology to make sensitive, like sort of the equivalent of legal decision-making, who gets a house, who gets a loan, or who gets financing for a house, who gets a loan, who gets, a job, that you have to do it in such a way where you're not sort of relying on protected categories like race or gender or whatnot. These are human rights applications that are built into our technology safeguards, and they're privacy applications that are built into our technology safeguards. So the way that these principles work is like a filter, because at the end of the day, ethics can be, about, there are many, many different perspectives. You have to weigh them, and you have to know what your true north is. And that's why the principles become really, really important. So I mentioned our council. I'll tell one little anecdote and stop. So we have this council. It has really robust debates about these issues, and people have differing perspectives by design. They may come from different places in a political spectrum. They come from different geographies, different races and genders and ethnicities. We have very robust debates. But at the end of the day, when we are sharing different perspectives of the issue, we keep holding up the looking glass. Like, how does this stand against human rights? How does this stand against privacy? And so on. And that's the way that we filter the actual decisions that we make as a company. It sounds like I just want to say, like, it's real. It really keeps coming back to what's our bottom line? What's our bottom line? What's our bottom line? What's our true north? And that's the discipline that we hold ourselves to.
So, bottom line is it needs to be embedded in the DNA, right, of the company.
Yeah.
So I think, and it's really a lot of times it's the top down is important, in terms of commitment from the senior management. You have such a great background. You have a PhD in anthropology. How does that play into your work? Does it?
Absolutely, yes. Because it's all about listening, right? And anthropologists, so what anthropologists do, kind of in essence, is they generally in cultures that they're outsiders to, in one way, shape, or form, they listen for what people consider to be common sense. That is to say, the values and norms that they have that they may not even know that they have. And I feel like I'm doing that translation all the time. Right? It's like, okay, so here are our values as a company, here are our principles, here's what our communities are telling us. They may be telling us things that are slightly at odds with each other. How do we decipher? How do we prioritize? And also, how do we make people feel heard? Because these are really complicated issues to sort through. They are not black and white. They take a lot of judgment and they take a lot of courage. And when you're making these decisions, sometimes even more important than just the decision is that people trust the process. And people trust the process when they feel heard. And anthropologists, if they know anything, they know how to listen really well. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, a very, very key skill for building out a function like this.
And a very key skill in building trust, in knowing,
absolutely,
feedback taken on board, people are being heard, and that in itself builds trust. So we've talked about COVID. It's a crazy year that has pushed us all into new ways of working. What are the considerations when rolling out some of these principles that you mentioned globally? And with COVID, have these challenges been amplified? I'm sure all of our work has evolved, and maybe you can share with us how your work has evolved. It's kind of like everything's moving in real time, right? You have to kind of like evolve in real time and adjust.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I'll even make it starker. I live in California. In California, so we have a global health crisis. We have, in the United States, we have a racial justice crisis playing out. We have an environmental crisis that California is feeling very strongly right now, that our air quality because of fires across the state is really poor. So it has been a very challenging year. But the upside of these multiple crises, at least for me, is that it brings the issues into super stark relief. And so it's like, what should we focus on? Okay, well, we should focus on technology that is affecting the pandemic. We should think about the intersection of racial justice and our technology. So, for example, and just to build on that for folks that have not been following the news in the United States, but a number of protests about police violence and against communities of color. And we started to look at, some of our own products in that capacity and just think about, like, how do we make sure that we're being super inclusive as we're building those products, and that we've got the right voices in those, in those product decision-making stories, building on our already existing diversity and inclusion efforts, and so on. So, I would say, if anything, while I'm certainly working much longer hours than I was pre-pandemic, it's really been invigorating, because it's like, yeah, this stuff matters more than it ever has. And we have an opportunity to impact, positively impact millions of people who will be using these products. So it's been really quite fascinating and like learning at warp speed how to do things at speeds I never imagined were possible before.
And I would say that one of the biggest positives that we've seen at SGInnovate, with the pandemic, is that moving everything online with our events enables us to have key thought leaders like yourself, come and join and keynote a session for our community, which would have otherwise been a bit more difficult because, it meant travel time and,
That's true.
So we found that, that has been a huge plus. We've managed to bring in wonderful speakers like yourself, because I think it's invaluable in terms of, your role and what you can share with the community, important messages that we can all take back and learn from.
But I will say, I have to respond to that. I will say, when this is over, I'm dying to come back to Singapore.
Hey.
Also, because the food is amazing there.
Sure, go visit where you mentioned that, where you lived in. I think you would see that. When was the last time you were in Singapore?
Oh, it was a while ago. I'm embarrassed to say. So I'm looking forward to it. When things are normal.
The time has changed. Yeah, us too. I can't wait for that. So we've come almost to the end of the session, and I think that this is a very, very important session. It's close to our hearts, as I mentioned. We're very passionate about deep tech for good. And the work that you're doing, the work that Salesforce is doing is important, how you're spearheading and leading the charge in this area. So perhaps in closing, I want to get your advice. What advice do you have for leaders who want to bring ethical use to the forefront of their business, but aren't sure they have the resources or background to do it?
That is a great question. And I would bring it back to listening, really. I would bring it back to start with your employees. Start with creating channels that employees, are trust, that they can raise questions and concerns, and that you see that not as a bad thing, but as a good thing, that is part of the culture to sort of anticipate risk. And that you then have a process where you can deputize people to like really weigh those issues and to prioritize appropriately. But But it really does, at the end of the day, it really does come down to kind of this mixture of humility and courage, knowing we don't have all the answers, that we're inventing the answers as we go, but that we will get it right if we do it together. And that's what I would say.
I love your point about inventing as we go. I think that, the recognition that we don't have a playbook, but we are defining and creating the playbook along the way. And I think the recognition that there will be some mistakes along the way, but adjusting it and, would then eventually get to where we want to be. But it is a living document, right? In terms of creating this playbook. We have to adjust along the way. Things will change. Environments will change, and there will be other critical events that happen that will force us to kind of rethink again and go back to a few steps back or a few steps forward. Well, I think that this session has been extremely enlightening, and I think it's been a very important conversation, which doesn't end here. We will continue to have such conversations, but I do want to thank you, Paula, for your time in sharing with us your thoughts and for the important role that you're playing in Salesforce and in the community on the whole. So with that, I thank you very much, and I thank Salesforce, the Salesforce team, for this wonderful partnership. I'm looking forward to more of that and seeing more wonderful news from Salesforce, and together hoping that we will eventually get to where we want to be in how we are using ethics in the way we do business and in the way that we are working with people from around the world.
Oh, thank you. It was such a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I'll look forward to different ways in which we can continue this conversation.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you everybody who have joined us. Happy to continue to connect, whether it's on LinkedIn, and I think there are a few chat messages that went between some of the attendees, which is always enlightening and heartening. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and Paula, good evening. Have a great evening with your kids. I think they were very well behaved, whatsoever. Thank you so much for that, and have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.